engagement of a differing of opinions. Yes?
Thank you, Professor. You are an asset for humanity. I follow.
Oh, I'm not going to disagree with that.
I'm a Muslim. More or less, I criticize the Arab states, like the Gulf states with Arabia, inflict wound on Palestinians. If you remember today, Secretary Pompeo in Cairo, he never mentioned the Palestinians by name when he made a speech. But he attacked more or less on Iran. What do you think about that?
States defend their interests. Right now, the Gulf states and the Saudi in particular, they see the primary adversary or challenge in the region to be Iran. And so they are now pretty much close to openly and formally aligning with Israel. But I think it's correct to say that if you look at the actual historical record, the Gulf states did provide a lot of material and financial support to the Palestinian struggle, but it came at a very big price. And the price was not only political, but it was also moral. The oil money of the 1970s, it totally corrupted the Palestinian cause. And probably, although it may be a cruel thing to say, had they not gotten that money, even though there would have been more suffering, for sure, the cause probably would have benefited from the absence of that support. Yes?
Greetings. Thank you for your talk and for making such a strong case. My name is Sheena, and I actually just returned from my first trip to Palestine just yesterday. I think one thing that was flooring to me, and by the way, I have two questions, was the, I don't know if I would call it division, but like division and treatment of Palestinians within the 48 territories within the West Bank, and then, now as you present this like severely unlivable conditions within Gaza and the Gaza Strip. And I remember somebody making a point to me that that level of division makes it really difficult to organize Palestinians within the occupied territories. And then I imagine just for folks who want to support internationally to really understand that level of like difference in terms of the dehumanization of Palestinians within those different territories. So I guess one thing I'm wondering is, we say free Palestine, right? And yet breaking down those differences like adds a level of complexity to the cause. And so I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on what it would mean to really think about liberation in that context? And then the other question is, I was just wondering another thing that I think I observed was the amount of presence that the Israeli economy has in the West Bank. So everywhere you go, the fruit stands have Israeli marked oranges, Israeli marked, goods, and I think it's really impossible for shopkeepers to not sell these goods, and yet there's this really strong international movement, or could be stronger, movement for BDS, and what are your thoughts on the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement? Thank you.
Well, it's hard to think of any movement to self-determination which wasn't burdened with all sorts of divisions, ethnic, religious, some of which obviously proved insurmountable The most notable case, of course, being India, where in the end about 1 million Indians were slaughtered in the division of India in 1947. So, on the other hand, one can imagine there have been moments where people are able to rise above their religious, tribal, ethnic, and all sorts of other loyalties, blood loyalties, and form a unified movement. It happened more or less in occupied territories during the first Intifada, though the first Palestinian uprising between 1988 and roughly to 1991. The exception was at that point Hamas, which did not belong to what was called the Unified National Command. But even there was a large amount of cooperation. A lot of the what you've experienced as divisions, it's a consequence of the fact that in the West Bank, in particular, the Palestinian struggle is not dead, but it's moribund. It's been, at least temporarily, it's been defeated. And it's one of the manifestations of defeat that all sorts of fragmentation occurs. You know, a movement is dying when it gets fragmented into all sorts of sects and pretty minor intra-movement squabbling. And there are many reasons for the collapse, the fragmentation of the Palestinian movement. Some of them are clearly outside its control, because the main reason is clear. It's that the humanitarian situation in the whole Middle East is now catastrophic, and next to Afghanistan, next to Iraq, next to Syria, next to Yemen, next to Libya, the Palestinian struggle has lost a lot of its salience in the public opinion. That's the factor that was out of their control. And then there were subjective factors which were within their control. And those two main factors were the Palestinian struggle had, like most struggles for self-determination, they had a vast, complex, and very lively and dynamic civil society. Everyone belonged to an organization. For those of you who are Palestinian or know anything about the history, if you went to the occupied territories in the 1970s or 1980s, everybody belonged to a political party. Everyone belonged to a political party. And everybody belonged to one mass organization or another. When the first Intifada, the mass civil resistance, broke out in December 7, 1987, it was spontaneous to begin with, but it wasn't a vacuum. The moment it broke out, there were all of these civil society organizations which immediately went into action. There was a huge amount of coordination. There was a lot of trust of these organizations because it was your friends, your neighbors, your workmates. And so it immediately resulted in a quite impressive resistance to the Israeli occupation. They're all gone now. There are no mass organizations in Palestine, none at all. What happened? Well, it's interesting what happened, because you should never underestimate the cleverness of your enemy. You should never overestimate them either. They're not as clever as they think they are, but they're not as stupid as you wish they were. And what happened in Palestine is they figured out this very clever idea. Whenever they would go into, let's say, a refugee camp or into a town, and there was always going to be one or two or three dynamic individuals, the kind of what we call charismatic types, who were also very clever and very smart. Now back then, if you were a charismatic, clever person, you would eventually end up as the leader of one of the mass organizations. What happened? Well, they created this thing called NGOs. And they scooped up every talented person, gave them a computer terminal and a cubicle in Ramallah and said you can say whatever you want. You could go on the web and you can talk about world revolution. We don't give a darn. Just recognize there are limits to what you can do. And then it became a real test of one's integrity. And I'm not in any way diminishing the kind of struggle individuals had to deal with. Because now they were earning salaries which were twice or three times what an ordinary Palestinian earned. And Ramallah now has among the highest living standards of any city in the world. My good friend Alan Nairn, who's visited both, some of you know him, the journalist, he says that Tel Aviv looks like a little village next to Ramallah. Wow. So it's very difficult to give that up. And so all of the talent, which normally would have gone into organizing, leading, galvanizing the mass organizations, they now hang out in their little cubicles in Gaza doing absolutely meaningless work, and then hanging out in the cafes of Gaza at night. And that did a lot of damage. All of the mass organizations have been hollowed out. They don't exist anymore except on paper. And the other disaster was the level of corruption, betrayal, treachery, wretchedness of the Palestinian leadership. It's very hard to keep up a struggle when you have leaders who are now doing the torturing to Israel, doing the killing to Israel. When Richard Goldstone issued his devastating report on Operation Cast Lead exactly 10 years ago now, the first major Israeli massacre in Gaza in a long while, it was the Palestinian Authority which killed the Goldstone report. Yes, it was.
How so?
How? Because it was making its way through this bureaucratic maze in the UN, and the United States at that time, Hillary Clinton in particular, who was the Secretary of State, she told the PA, if you want us to continue paying you, you have to kill the report. And they killed the report. They were the ones who killed the International Court of Justice opinion on the legality of the wall Israel is building in the occupied territories. Facts are facts, as the British proverb says, and as Vladimir Ilyich Lenin liked to quote, facts are stubborn things. The Palestinian leadership supported Israel during Operation Cast Lead. The Palestinian leadership supported Israel during Operation Protective Edge. The Palestinian leadership is now doing everything it can to suffocate Gaza. How can you be inspired by a leadership like that? It kills the movement. It kills the movement. I'm not saying the other leaders of other movements were of impeccable character. The South African ANC has revealed itself to be a complete and total disaster. The same levels of corruption. Nicaragua. I remember the days when you would come to New York and there would be audiences 10 times the size of this in Riverside Church, and they would chant, Daniel, 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 Daniel. That reminded me a wee bit too much of Chairman Mao, Chairman Mao, Chairman Mao, and I got to that stage, so I wasn't particularly enamored of these demonstrations of genuflection and groveling. And he turned out to be a pretty creepy character, Mr. Ortega. So I'm not saying other movements were pure, but the one thing that can be said is the other movements won something, and then they became degenerate. That's what people used to say about the Palestinians. Their movement is already degenerate, and they don't have a state yet. So it's been a complete disaster. disaster. Just on a side note, most of you will have no recollection, but someday what I say now will resonate. I had a close friend, a very brilliant woman, a woman of just extraordinary intellect. Her name was Annette Rubinstein, and she was a genuine activist. She was one of those types who took her intellect and brought it into the street. And she was in the Communist Party, and she once said to me, "It's incorrect to say that McCarthyism destroyed the Communist Party." She said, "That's not true. The people of the Communist Party were very tough, thick-skinned, had their beliefs, and they were willing to go and do and sacrifice what it took for their beliefs." She said what killed the Communist Party was not McCarthyism, it was Khrushchev's speech in 1956. When they realized everything they had believed in, for a large part, was a fraud, a lie. And that was devastating. And so it has to be said in the case of the Palestinian struggle, that a large part, a large share of the responsibility for the disaster that has ensued is not because of the objective factors. Yes, it's terrible, but people have endured terrible situations. The young man who drove me here today, he's Vietnamese. And it was always a source of wonder to me. How could the Vietnamese, for 30 years, beginning with the French during World War II, and then through 1975, how could they have endured this non-stop, devastating bombing? The United States was dropping the equivalent of several atomic bombs in Vietnam every month. And I remember I asked Professor Chomsky, Judith's brother-in-law, I once asked him that question, and he said he too was really perplexed. How could they have done that? And then I once asked a senior member of what was called back then the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam. I asked that question to him, and his answer was immediate. He said it was the party. The party was so strong. They were so committed. Now, commitment also includes ruthlessness, and we can't close our eyes to that fact. They were ruthless, but they were also idealistic, austere, simple, totally 150% committed to that cause. If the Palestinian Authority were negative 5% committed to its cause, I would say that would be an improvement in what we have today. Yes?
Hi, good evening. I want to thank you very much for coming to Philadelphia because I've read about you, but I'm very glad to finally hear you in person. For the past several weeks, I've had some very intense conversations with people about the Zionist attacks against Dr. Marc Lamont Hill, Alice Walker, and Angela Davis. And when they would attack them, they would say, oh, they're anti-Semitic. I would ask them, well, if you say they are anti-Semitic, then who are the Semitic people? Can you define that for me? And they never could. None of these people, over 3 weeks of conversations, none of them can tell me who the Semitic people are or are not. So my question to you is, it seems like we really need some serious political education, and if you could refer us to any kind of articles or books or whatever to read about that, I think that would be very helpful. My second question real quickly is, have you encountered any black people who are Zionists, such as Chloe Baldry and Reverend Zuma Sani Washington? They've been on the lecture circuit as well, so thank you.
I don't think it's useful get into a semantical, what's essentially a semantical question about what is the Semitic people or what is an anti-Semite, the definitional question. I think it's a reasonable shorthand to say that if somebody harbors animus towards Jews for no rational reason except that they're Jews, then you could say that it constitutes some form, you might say, of anti-Semitism. In fact, that formulation is not particularly useful for reasons I don't want to get into now because it becomes a digression. In the case of the three individuals that you mentioned, I'm not sure if I want to. I know Alice Walker reasonably well, and I like her, and when I go out to California, I make a point of spending time with her. I would say it's really a stretch to describe Alice Walker as an anti-Semite, if for no other reason, and you may think it's a trivial reason, but it's quite clear from even talking to her briefly, that the person she most admires, reveres, and really at some level loves, is Howard Zinn, who was her mentor at Spelman before she transferred to Sarah Lawrence. And she speaks about him, and not least because she found him very handsome. She was young, she was in college. Everyone at Spelman loved Howard Zinn. Spelman's an all girls school. Was it back then? It still is, yes. All girls school. So she has her idiosyncrasies, as we all do, and her eccentricities, as we all do. So I just find that I don't find it compelling. She likes certain authors who others think are quacks. But if I might use one more time the case of Professor Chomsky, he thinks almost all authors are quacks. At least when they write on politics. So if you like any of them, you fall into the same category at some level as Alice Walker. In the case of Angela Davis, she's positively ridiculous to describe her as an anti-Semite for the reasons she gave. Angela Davis grew up in a Communist Party family, actually in Birmingham. Actually, it's a funny story. She said that when she went off to college, everybody was saying, don't go, stay away from the communists. She said, I didn't want to be near the communists because I was tired of them. The only people that ever came to our house were communists. The only people that ever had for dinner was communists. I wanted to meet real radicals. And being in the Communist Party, she internalized a large part of the anti-Semitism, anti-fascism ethic of the time. There was, of course, a lot of awful things in the practice of the Communist Party, but as an ethic, it was clearly anti-Semitic, you can say philo-Semitic, as an ethic, not its practice. So Angela Davis was far-fetched. Marc Lamont Hill, I don't know him. I did meet Angela a few months ago. She was a childhood idol before Paul Robeson came along. She was black, she was beautiful, she was brilliant. And Time magazine said at the time, I remember I was only around 15 years old, I was sitting in the library and I was reading an article about her that said she had the biggest afro this side of the Zambezi River. So she was every Jewish boy's dream. And I felt in love with Angela Davis. I told her this in front of a large audience. She quietly tiptoed out of the room, never to return. As far as Marc Lamont Hill, I don't know much about him other than involved in the Palestine movement for 35 years. I've frankly never heard of him. And I did find, though, a little bit disquieting how quickly he recanted from the statement that he made. It was really quite, I know it's a strong word, and I hope people will forgive me, but I felt it was kind of contemptible. I still am with Paul Robeson. You behave honorably and you behave responsibly. You make a statement. That either you're serious about the statement or you're not serious about the statement. If you're not serious about the statement, then it's just radical chic. It's posturing and posing. If you're serious about the statement, then you would have researched before you made the statement, and you would have stood by it regardless of the consequences. I will not retreat 1,000th part of 1 inch. Paul Robeson in 1948, he was making $200,000 a year. He was a very impressive, popular performer. In 1949, when he was indicted and every concert hall in the U.S. closed its doors to him, his income fell to $6,000. And for the remainder of his life, he was effectively crucified. When he was 62 years old, he went into seclusion, as some of you know, in Philadelphia. He went to live with his sister Marianne, never had any contact with anyone. If you saw the pictures of him, as I have the Martin Duberman biography, he was a massive physical figure. He was 6 feet 5. He was All-American football, All-American baseball, All-American football, All-American track. He won 11 varsity letters at Rutgers and was captain of the debating team and valedictorian of his class because he was African American. He wasn't allowed in the Glee Club, which you can laugh at now. He put everything on the line. He could have recanted. He could have done what a lot of others did back then. He could have recanted. I will not retreat 1,000th part of 1 inch. So I cannot say I admired very much how Mr. Lamont Hill carried on when he came under some assault, yes. He lost his position at, was it CNN?
Yes, sir.
Right. Well, I'm now 65 years old. I've never been on American television, never once. Never once. I have never been on national or local television, even though many knowledgeable people say I am the most knowledgeable person in the world now on the Israel-Palestine conflict. When my book on Gaza came out, it really received, I think, stellar blurbs from the top people in the world. The international jurist John Dugard, the international jurist Alfred Zayas. It was very well received. In fact, Professor Chomsky wrote me and said, I've never seen blurbs like the ones he got for the book. And yet, except for Professor Chomsky's review, I never received a review for the book. I didn't get one. Not one review. And that's as the demonstrations are unfolding in Gaza, which by serendipity, as I said before, the book came out just as the demonstrations began. I lost my tenure position at DePaul University 13 years ago. I never worked another day in my life. You know? But would I ever entertain the idea of retracting a statement, a serious statement on a serious issue because of the pressure exerted on me? And I frankly, and you can disagree with me, I don't think losing a slot on CNN is exactly Christ being nailed to the cross. Yes.
Which one is it?
Thank you, Dr. for speaking here. Having read only a little bit of your work, very intrigued by what you said. I guess my question is more of a personal note, because I feel like you and I have a more similar background. I'm from an upper middle class Jewish background, and I'm just thinking now of I'm culturally Jewish more than anything else, but I'm just anticipating my discussion at Passover Seder. How do I deal with family members who shut down conversation, refuse to listen, basically refuse to even accept any semblance of a conversation about the plights of Palestine that are very, very real? And how do I circumvent the indoctrination I had as a kid in the DC suburbs, basically being told, the number one tenet of being an American Jew is support Israel without question or condition. And I feel like, how do I do this in a way that is both to my point, but also, this might be difficult, how do I not completely get kicked out of the, out of the Passover Seder table?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's accurate to describe myself as coming from the upper middle class. My parents were very economical. We used to say in my home that in order to defrost the steak, we put it in the freezer. I guess you have to be Jewish to read it. Judy's laughing. You get the idea. Now, as to what you do with these die-hard relatives of yours, Comrade Leon Trotsky was once asked what you should do with fascists, and he replied, acquaint them with the pavement. But I know, in particular on Passover, so I'm not going to recommend that strategy. I think as a practical matter, there are some people who can't be convinced, and there's no point in trying to convince them. It's just a squandering of time and energy. So on the other hand, the American scene has completely changed. And it's changing so rapidly that it's hard for me to even assimilate what's happening. So take the case, Dr. Montero mentioned that Angela Davis was denied the award at the Birmingham Civil Rights Center Institute. I was kind of astonished. The Times put that story on its front page. The New York Times, Angela used to be this Black Panther militant communist, and you don't even mention her in polite company. And now they put on the front page that she was denied the award because of her support for Israel. I had to do a double take on that. And then 3 weeks ago, when the Great March in Gaza had already disappeared, not only from the headlines, but from the inside pages of the newspapers, the Times decides there's this main article on the front page, the main article, to investigate what happened to Rizan al-Najjar, the young Palestinian medic, who was killed by the Israeli snipers. And the Times concludes it was at best recklessness and possibly a war crime. Now you have to keep in mind, nobody forced the Times to run that article. It was a very large investigative piece with all sorts of very sophisticated web technology to recreate what happened. This is the Times. And all around us, the cause of Israel is rapidly before our eyes. It's disintegrating. Now the reason it's disintegrating is complex, because it's not just Israel and Palestine what's happening. American Jews overwhelmingly are on the liberal, moderate to liberal end of the political spectrum. They overwhelmingly vote in every election for the Democratic Party. About 80% of American Jews identify themselves as either Democrats or independents. Now bear in mind, the Jews are by far the richest ethno-religious group in the United States. So they were voting, as most people do, with their pocketbooks. They should be voting Republican. But no, they overwhelmingly vote Democrat, and a large chunk thereof describe themselves as liberal. Now it's no surprise to anybody in the room that the bane of American Jews, as of liberals, is the current occupant of the White House, Mr. Trump, and his chief supporter, in many respects, his inspirer, is Benjamin Netanyahu. And Israel, its population, apart from the Philippines, it's the only country in the world where the population overwhelmingly supports Donald Trump. And so for American Jews, this is totally incomprehensible. The person who is most loathed in the liberal, moderate, Democratic Party sectors of the United States is the most admired and respected by Israel's leadership and Israel's population, and forced to choose. They choose their American values over their Jewish values. If you look at Mr. Trump, virtually a large part of the agenda, rhetorical agenda, is coming, it's just made in Israel. Where did he get the idea for the wall? Where did he get the idea for shooting, in this case, shooting tear gas at the refugees along the wall? Why did he give that order? It's quite interesting, incidentally, that the firing of tear gas on the demonstrators on the Mexican side of the border elicited so much outrage from the liberal and moderate media, whereas firing live weapons at the people of Gaza, who are overwhelmingly demonstrating a far distance from the wall, about 200 yards away. Razan al-Najjar, she was about 150 yards away from the wall. That elicits much less condemnation from the American media. But in general, the American Jews are finding it impossible to reconcile their loathing for Trump with supporting Israel. And that, to my thinking, is at the particular juncture, it's the main factor accounting for the alienation, the estrangement, and one could even use a stronger word, the defection of American Jews for Israel. Now you might say, what's going to happen if and when a Democrat is elected to Congress? I think now the picture is very different. There is a large, youthful contingent in the House of Representatives presently that will not defer to the sensibilities of their elders when it comes to Israel. If Israel were now, or even if a Democrat is elected into office, if Israel were to launch another one of its periodic massacres, whether in Gaza or in Lebanon, there's a large contingent of young congresspeople who will speak loudly and probably garner a significant amount of attention. So even when Trump eventually, it is hoped, departs from the Oval Office, I still think the picture is very different now. I think there's every reason to expect that even in the absence of a Trump presidency, there's going to be a gradual deterioration in estrangement from Israel. Because Israel is, and I don't say this with any kind of glee or schadenfreude, that's this fancy German, or deriving pleasure from other people's suffering. Israel is a complete crazy state. They're complete lunatics. The sane voices in Israel are the first ones to say it. This country has gone completely bonkers. It's nuts. If you want to understand the mentality of the typical Israeli, and yes, you can generalize, and if you say it's a stereotype, I will remind you that the word stereotype is just the pejorative for generalization, and what makes a generalization is it's generally true. Israelis are nuts. They are very reminiscent of whites in the American South on the eve of the Civil Rights Movement. They are very dug in. They are very self-righteous. In their minds, and as in the American South, where they wanted to preserve, they thought they had every right to preserve this Southern way of life, in the same way the Israelis want to preserve that Jewish way of life, and it's really, one has to say, it's really evil. It's evil of a particularly, I'd say, egregious kind, but I wouldn't call it exceptional. I don't believe in notions like original sin, like Israel was born in original sin, the expulsion of the indigenous population, and therefore it's unredeemable. I don't believe in those notions. Our country was born in a double sin. It was born in the sin of the expulsion, the extermination of the native population, and it was born in the sin of slavery. But nonetheless, there's a long way to go, and I know it's a cliche, and I know with each advance there is a regression. But still, I think it's fair to say that the U.S. has become, even in my lifetime, in the brief span of a person's lifetime, the U.S. has become a much more civilized place. In fact, the place where it's become most civilized, interestingly enough, is in the American South. Now, I notice there are a large number of African Americans in the audience, and you're free to correct me, but I've met many, many African Americans who say they want to retire to the South. They say it's much more civilized than the North. That's a very, for somebody who grew up as I did during the Civil Rights era, to hear the South is a much more civilized place than the North coming from the African Americans. What?
The housing cost.
I hear many things, but not just housing. They say the pace of life and things like that.
So, one time, she has a question.
Yeah.
One time.
Okay, so actually, when I was at Temple in 2011, we actually brought you as a speaker. So hey. So I was just gonna say that after 2011, I think up 2 years after that, there were some Palestinians that called you out for not supporting the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And I kind of read into it. I didn't read into it fully, but I wanted to ask you what happened. What did you say? What do you think of it? How do you see it?
First of all, my differences with the BDS movement, they came at I would say, a significant price. I used to speak about 40 times a year, and now I guess this is the second time I've spoken in the last year. And that's essentially because the BDS movement took me to be an enemy of what they call a liberal Zionist. Yeah, that was kind of my reaction. The differences really are pretty basic and they're simple, and then you can decide what you think. First of all, the BDS program, or what it's called, its foundational principles, they're all anchored, as they say in their statement, the BDS statement. They say that they anchor their principles in international law. That's how they begin. And then they derive from international law the right of self-determination. And then from the right of self-determination, they derive 3 other rights. Ending the occupation, full equality of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, and implementation of the right to return. Now, as it stands, that to me is all correct, and it's a correct interpretation of the law. And it's the positions I've always, not even say always, but in my adult life, my mature years, those are positions I came to support after doing the requisite research and consideration, reflection. But then you have a problem, and the problem is the following. The problem is, there's a basic principle of law, that you have rights under the law, but you also have obligations and responsibilities under the law. And you can't claim rights if you forego your obligations. In fact, if you read Gandhi, as I have, he says that he thinks it's more important to learn your obligations than it is to demand your rights. He felt strongly that you should learn first and most importantly how to discipline yourself before you demand your rights. But let's leave Gandhi's position aside and say it's a peculiarity or eccentricity peculiar to him. you understand the obvious principle. You have no right to walk at the green if you refuse to stop at the red. And if an officer were to stop you when you were trying to walk at the green, you say, that's my right. If the officer were to stop you when you were walking at the red, and the officer said to you, excuse me, ma'am, that's a red light. And you say, well, I take no position on the red. I only have a position on the green. I have a right to walk at the green. So BDS says Palestinians under international law, they have the right to self-determination, and they have the derivative rights to ending the occupation, full equality under the law in Israel, and the right of return. But the law also says that under international law, Israel is a state. Now, you may not like that law, just as an aggressive pedestrian, you might not like to be stopped at the red light, but that's the law. Now, you could say, as many people, including, I suspect, a number of people in the room, you may want to say, I don't give a darn about the law. That's all white, racist, imperialist, so on and so forth, created law. I have nothing to do with it, which of course is a completely legitimate position. But alas, that's not BDS's position. The very first sentence of the BDS points of principle is that we're anchored in international law. Now, some people are quite effective at being hypocrites and charlatans and mountebanks. They can go on stage, I guess it's an unfair thing to say, but you'll forgive me. One of the things that really shocked me about Alan Dershowitz was when I was growing up, my parents always used to throw out the phrase, a pathological lie. He's a pathological lie. She's a pathological lie. I never, it was just a phrase. But when I saw Dershowitz, it was like for the first time I saw in the flesh a pathological liar. He was able, without missing a beat, there wouldn't be if he had a polygraph put to his wrist, it wouldn't miss a beat. He was just able to say the most fantastical things. He really was a clinically pathological liar. I happen not to be very effective at that. If I gain any kind of respect and regard in the public arena, it's because people say, well, whatever he says, he really believes it. And he's not a liar. He's not a hypocrite. He's not duplicitous. He's crazy. He's Meshuggah. But he's not a liar or a hypocrite. I couldn't support a program like that. I couldn't possibly go before an audience and say, well, according to international law, Israel is not a state. I couldn't do that. That's at a moral level, on a legal level. As a political question, it's a non-starter. It's a dead end. The moment you go before the broad audience and you step outside your cult and you say you don't recognize Israel, you lose 3/4 of the people in the room. You actually lose 9/10. How do I know that? How do I know that? Let's take a simple example. Let's take the two most mainstream left, it's called now progressive, left candidates in the Anglo-American world. In the UK, it's clearly Jeremy Corbyn. And Corbyn is really, he's a very impressive guy in terms of his principles. Very impressive guy. He takes positions which nobody in the Western world would dare take. However, he's very unequivocal on one point. two states. He doesn't want to hear from one state. It's not a topic of discussion. If you take the United States, Bernie is our Corbyn Light. He's Corbyn L-I-T-E. He's Corbyn Light. And he said on many occasions very good things with regard to the Palestinians. Very good things. He came out with a very strong statement against the legislation now in Congress to criminalize BDS. He says it's criminalizing people's rights to their beliefs, absolutely out, you know? But you won't hear from anything except two states. It's not even a topic. So you want me to advocate a position which, to use the fancy Latin term, ad initio, from the start, loses me 9/10 of my audience. That doesn't make sense to me. That doesn't seem to me, that doesn't seem to me a winnable strategy. That's as a political matter. And then there's the practical matter. The practical matter is BDS makes claims which, so far as I can tell, having studied and continue to study the record, I regard as fantastical. The recognized leader of the BDS, Omar Barghouti, he said a couple of years ago, Israel now faces, because of BDS, Israel now faces imminent collapse. Is that plausible? Does that have any connection with reality? Israel has been brought to imminent collapse because of BDS. Now you might want to reply, as perfectly a reasonable reply. You might want to say, well, if everything you're saying is true, Professor Finkelstein, why is, or Norm, Comrade Norm, why is Israel carrying on hysterically over BDS? Why is it passing all of this legislation? Why is it mobilizing so much resources? And I would reply, and I'm not saying it just a debating point, I would reply, having studied the record carefully, BDS is the greatest thing that ever happened to Israel. BDS is to Israel what the Hamas rockets are to Israel. These are just inventions. There are no Hamas rockets. Those are just enhanced fireworks. Hamas was said to have fired 5,000 rockets at Israel during Operation Protected Edge. If you look at the actual records by Israel, constructed by Israel, those 5,000 rockets destroyed one house. One house. And it wasn't because of Iron Dome, which is another fantasy. But Israel loves those so-called rockets because it gives them a pretext to periodically go into Gaza and, as they say, mow the grass. And now Israel has used the BDS in a kind of preemptive strike. Because Trump is in the White House, they know that they can get away with next to anything. So they want to illegalize all opposition to Israel. In particular in places where that opposition has become very vocal, such as college campuses. So what does it do? It claims that all the opposition to Israel is BDS. Anything critical of Israel, they say that's BDS. And then, once it's been declared BDS, and BDS has the status of a bogey, they get to suppress and silence all criticism of Israel. So it's been a windfall for Israel. It's fantastic what they've done. And there's no question in my mind that that legislation that's being enacted at local level and hopefully more at a national level, it's a real problem. It's a real problem. And I will certainly acknowledge that however you tailor your message to the public, even with two states, they would, because of the Trump administration, Israel's armies would still try to illegalize it. I recognize that. But the BDS handed them a silver platter because it said we won't recognize Israel. Israel is an illegitimate state and blah, 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 blah. And it made it so easy. It would still have been a battle. I know that. I have no doubt about it. But BDS was like those Hamas rockets. They were a windfall for Israel. And they're running with it. They call any criticism of Israel now, they say that's BDS. So if a company wants to say, we won't advertise houses in the West Bank, Airbnb, they say that's BDS. Any criticism or any attempt to boycott the settlements, which of course has nothing to do with BDS, it's just international law, they say it's BDS. So I think the claims made by BDS about its effectiveness, its efficacy, I think those claims are wildly overblown and wildly inflated. And there has been one consequence, which I think has been devastating. The consequence is this. Everybody is waiting for mass nonviolent resistance to erupt in the occupied territories. You heard for years, the third intifada, the third intifada. When is the third intifada? Well, guess what? It happened. It happened in Gaza. It's been going on now for nearly a year. Mass, nonviolent civil resistance by the most destitute component of the Palestinian population. Now ask yourself, has there been one demonstration in support of Gaza? One. Nothing. All I hear is BDS. On May 14th, when there was the massacre in Gaza, I said, where's the solidarity movement? And they told me there was this female singer who was going to sing in Tel Aviv, and they were focused on trying to stop her. What's her name?
Lana Del Rey. I don't know.
What's her name?
Lana Del Rey.
Yeah, I don't know.
Read the news.
It was kind of, I didn't read the news, but I filter out nonsense. I filter out nonsense and noise. And I suspect she falls in both categories. All you heard about was BDS. I think it's kind of shocking. The people there are desperate for support. I'm in contact with them. I would not say any longer on a daily basis, but certainly a weekly basis. They're desperate for support. And the BDS movement, which always claims that it is the most representative organization of Palestinian civil society, and it lists these 10,000 organizations, all of which consist of one person in the Ramallah cubicle. Wow. They keep saying they represent the Palestinians, and here are the Palestinians begging for support. Why aren't you doing anything? Nothing. Complete dead silence. That's really a scandal, actually.
So that's a question.
No, that's good. One more question. The two people,
everybody. Do you live in America?
I
Do you live in America?
I live in Brooklyn.
Oh, I mean, you said America had become civilized, and I was wondering, what are you talking about? You know what I mean? Because not only did America have two, you say, in moral sense, Indians and slaves, every organization, every group, especially blacks, that had tried to come up, Rosewood, the Deacons of Defense, right now in America, a black man can walk out in the street and get his head shot off for nothing. I mean, I just had to ask you that, because we see two different Americans.
No, I think we live in the same America, and I said, I was careful about it, that each step of progress, in my opinion, it does come with regress. I see that. If you were to ask me whether things are better now, I would say probably on the whole, if you ask women, if you ask children, if you ask, I would say probably a majority of African Americans who lived through the pre-civil rights era, you would say, yes, things are better. However, say that the younger generation, which is hooked on antidepressants, Facebook, and internet pornography, I can't say that's an improvement. I don't believe that's an improvement. I actually think that people can strongly disagree with me. I think if I were to ask which is better, I would say there's a strong case to be made that say being raised in a Muslim family, your innocence is preserved, and there's respect for elders, and especially the most elderly of the elders. I think a lot can be said, and I know this is contrary to received wisdom. A lot can be said for the fact that the way young people are raised in conservative Muslim societies is probably, there's a good argument to be made, is healthier and better. So I'm not saying everything is, I don't believe anymore in the notion of a steady up curve of progress. I don't think that's accurate. Most people equate the progress with increasing accessibility to enhanced forms of technology. That's my cup of tea. Gandhi once said, he said, what distinguishes Western and Eastern philosophy is this. He said, in Western philosophy, an individual progresses as he or she multiplies his or her needs, and then technology becomes progressively more sophisticated so as to accommodate those needs. Those of you who are old enough to remember, there was a famous exhibit at the 1963 World's Fair, and it was the general election exhibit, and it was a stage where the people sitting revolved, and the theme was, it's a great big beautiful tomorrow, it's a great big beautiful tomorrow, and it starts out with people living in a log cabin, and then it moves to people who are living in a simple home with a refrigerator and some other electrical appliance. And then it came to the present day, and it had a color TV, and it had lots of gadgets. And then that fourth stage, which I'll never forget, it was just dazzling appliances, and you could see the lights reflecting on them. it's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow. And Gandhi said, I don't really agree with that. I think human progress occurs when you become less and less dependent on technology, and you become more and more, you find your gratification and satisfaction inside yourself. So when Gandhi was asked, what is your goal? What is your objective in life, personally? He replied, I want to reduce myself to a zero. Now, that might be a pretty stark contrast, but if you were to ask me which of the two I find more appealing, I would have to say the Gandhi vision. I don't understand people who have an incessant need to communicate to the world every passing insipid thought that passes through their head, either by texting or by talking. I sometimes walk in the street and can't you shut up for one effing second? Must you constantly be talking? I don't own a cell phone, I never did. I don't own an iPhone, I don't own any of those gadgets. Because I think there's a certain virtue in being alone with your thoughts. Just walking the street alone with your thoughts. So, I don't see this upward curve of progress, but with all due respect to you, sir, if you lived before the 1960s, if you knew what happened in our society, I mean, husbands have the right to beat the daylights out of women, their wives. If you called the cops would come in and very reticent because it's a family matter. You had the right to beat a kid silly in public. And when I say silly, I don't mean laughable silly. I remember I was once in a subway. A man is holding a baby. I'm 2 years old. Beating the kid, and everybody's like this. Everyone knew something horrible was happening, but you weren't allowed to say a word. I finally did say, hey, what the hell are you doing? And he said, what do you think he said? It's my child. You know? Now, have problems erupted in the wake of the corrections that were made? Yes. There are aspects of the current Me Too movement which I find problematic, and there are aspects of rights of children which I find, the way it's construed, which I find problematic. But overall, I think it's a better place. Okay, folks, nice.
Thank you everyone for coming tonight.
I guess so.